Every HPLC separation your lab runs today rests on a principle Archer Martin and Richard Synge earned the 1952 Nobel Prize for partition chromatography, the differential distribution of analytes between a stationary and a mobile phase. This Beckman Model 324 system from the late 1970s already had the essential architecture pump, column, detector that every modern UHPLC instrument still follows. HPLC separates analytes by forcing a pressurized mobile phase through a column packed with stationary phase particles as small as 1.5 to 5 micrometers. The smaller the particle, the higher the efficiency, and the higher the back pressure the pump has to overcome. Retention itself is governed by the partition coefficient. How strongly an analyte favors the stationary phase over the mobile phase at equilibrium. Band broadening, the enemy of resolution, is governed by the Van Deemter equation, which sums three independent contributions: eddy diffusion from uneven flow paths around packing particles, longitudinal diffusion of analyte molecules along the column axis, and resistance to mass transfer as molecules equilibrate between phases. Modern sub-2 micrometer particles minimize the mass transfer term, exactly why UHPLC delivers sharper peaks at the same run time. Column efficiency is expressed as theoretical plate number. N equals 16 times the square of retention time divided by peak width. A sharper, narrower peak at a given retention time means a higher plate count and better resolving power. A well-packed 15 centimeter reverse phase column routinely delivers 10,000 to 20,000 theoretical plates, and that efficiency climbs directly as particle size shrinks. Extra column band broadening is a purely mechanical trap. Oversized connecting tubing, a worn injector rotor seal, or a detector flow cell that's too large all add dead volume the analyte diffuses through before detection, widening every peak regardless of how well the column itself performs. Always troubleshoot tubing and fittings before you condemn a column. Typical analytical HPLC operates at 1 to 2 milliliters per minute against back pressures of 100 to 400 bar. Sub-2 micrometer UHPLC columns routinely push past 1000 bar, exactly why UHPLC instruments need pumps and fittings rated for pressures conventional HPLC hardware was never built to handle. A nuance worth repeating to new technologists. Retention time alone never confirms analyte identity. Co-eluting interference at the same retention time are a classic source of false positive peak calls. Exactly why spectral confirmation or mass spec detection matters for anything clinically consequential. Before instrumentation, resolution between two peaks depends on exactly three things you can tune independently: column efficiency, selectivity between the two analytes, and the retention factor itself. Every method development decision you'll ever make comes back to moving one of these three levers. Two pump strategies dominate method design. Isocratic elution runs a fixed mobile phase composition throughout, ideal for simple, stable separations like routine drug level panels. Gradient elution progressively changes solvent polarity during the run, essential for complex mixtures spanning a wide range of hydrophobicity, like a broad toxicology screen. Gradient methods cost more re-equilibration time between injections but dramatically improve peak capacity. A UV-vis detector remains the default workhorse. As the column effluent passes through a flow cell, absorbance at a fixed or scanned wavelength, typically 210 to 280 nanometers for most drugs and metabolites, is converted directly into a chromatographic peak. Photodiode array detection extends this by capturing a full spectrum at every data point, letting you confirm peak identity and purity from spectral shape alone. Detector choice is really a sensitivity trade-off. UV detection reliably quantifies down to nanogram per milliliter concentrations. Fluorescence adds roughly 2 orders of magnitude more sensitivity for naturally fluorescent or derivatized analytes, and tandem mass spectrometry pushes limits of detection into the picogram range while adding the definitive structural confirmation most clinical toxicology and TDM work now requires. The mobile phase reservoir, degasser, autosampler, column, and detector form a fixed sequence regardless of manufacturer, but the detector family tree branches widely from there: UV-vis and photodiode array for routine work, fluorescence for trace-level sensitivity, refractive index for compounds with no useful chromophore, evaporative light scattering for lipids, and mass spectrometry. Now the reference standard for definitive clinical identification. A myth worth retiring. UHPLC and HPLC are not simply faster versions of the same method. Transferring a validated HPLC method to a UHPLC platform without revalidating peak identity, resolution, and linearity is a recognized source of method transfer failures, since particle size, pressure, and extra column volume all change the separation simultaneously. Weigh UHPLC against conventional HPLC honestly. Resolution and throughput both improve substantially, but capital cost, pump and column consumable expense, and the required pressure rating across every fitting in the flow path all rise too. A genuine consideration for labs deciding where to allocate a limited capital budget. 6 components make up nearly every HPLC system you'll service: the mobile phase reservoir and online degasser, the high-pressure pump, the autosampler, the column housed in a temperature-controlled oven, the detector, and the data system integrating everything into a reportable chromatogram. Knowing which component owns which failure mode is most of practical troubleshooting. Bubbles in the pump head are the single most common cause of erratic baseline noise and irreproducible retention times reported to service engineers. Always confirm the online degasser is functioning and the mobile phase was properly filtered and degassed before troubleshooting anything further downstream. Bottom line on hardware: every instrument, whatever the manufacturer or generation, still lives or dies on the same 6 components and the same physics. Pick your detector for the sensitivity your analyte demands, and troubleshoot systematically from injector to data system rather than jumping straight to blaming the column. These Beckman ultrasphere columns from the late 1970s already used chemically bonded octadecylsilane C18 packing, the reverse phase chemistry that still dominates clinical HPLC methods today. Reverse phase separates by hydrophobicity. Nonpolar analytes cling to the nonpolar C18 surface and elute later, while polar analytes wash through fast with the aqueous mobile phase. 4 separation modes cover nearly every clinical HPLC application. Reverse phase for the majority of small molecule drug and toxicology work. Normal phase for very polar or poorly water-soluble compounds. Ion exchange, the reference method separating hemoglobin variants by surface charge for HbA1c testing. And size exclusion for separating by molecular size alone, used in protein and polymer characterization. A typical reverse phase mobile phase blends an aqueous buffer with an organic modifier, acetonitrile or methanol, and the ratio, not just the identity of the organic solvent, is what you tune first during method development. A 10 percentage point shift in organic content can move a critical pair's retention time by minutes. Column pH stability is a real operating limit, not a footnote. Conventional silica-based C18 columns degrade outside roughly pH 2 to 8 as the silica backbone itself dissolves at high pH. Exactly why ion pairing or hybrid particle columns get selected for basic drug analytes that need a higher pH mobile phase to stay unionized and retained. Systematic chromatogram review follows the same sequence every time. Confirm baseline stability and system pressure first. Check the internal standard peak for retention time and area consistency. Identify analyte peaks against retention time windows. Then evaluate peak shape for tailing or fronting before you trust a single reported concentration. A myth worth correcting. Peak tailing is not always a column problem. Column overload from too much sample mass, a poorly buffered mobile phase, or secondary interactions with residual silanol groups on the packing all produce identical-looking tailing. Diagnosing the actual cause before replacing an expensive column saves real money. Visually, a clean chromatogram is simple to read. A flat baseline, a sharp internal standard peak at its expected retention time, and analyte peaks resolved to baseline with no shoulders or shared valleys. Any deviation from this shape is your first visual cue that something upstream needs investigation before the numbers are trusted. Choosing between normal phase and reverse phase isn't arbitrary. Reverse phase dominates because most clinically relevant small molecules are moderately polar to nonpolar, and reverse phase tolerates aqueous biological matrices far better, while normal phase remains reserved for genuinely lipophilic compounds like certain fat-soluble vitamins where reverse phase retention becomes impractically weak. A quick recall device for method development priorities. In the order you should actually tune them: selectivity first via chemistry and mobile phase pH, efficiency second via particle size and flow rate, retention third via organic modifier percentage. SER keeps you from wasting a week optimizing flow rate before you've even picked the right column chemistry. HbA1c forms through a slow, essentially irreversible, non-enzymatic reaction. Glucose's aldehyde group condenses with the N-terminal valine of the hemoglobin beta chain to form an unstable Schiff base, which then undergoes an Amadori rearrangement into a stable ketoamine that persists for the 120-day lifespan of the red cell. That's exactly why HbA1c reflects average glycemic exposure over roughly the preceding 2 to 3 months. Cation-Exchange HPLC separates glycated from non-glycated hemoglobin purely by surface charge. Glycation neutralizes a positive charge on the N-terminal valine, making HbA1c slightly less positively charged than HbA0. So it elutes earlier under an increasing salt gradient. The percentage HbA1c is calculated directly from the ratio of the glycated fraction peak area to total hemoglobin peak area. Hemoglobin variants are the interference every technologist has to know cold. HBS, HBC, and HBE co-migrate near or overlap the A1C region on many cation exchange methods and can produce a falsely low or falsely elevated result, depending on the specific variant and platform. Any HbA1c report with an unexplained discordant clinical picture should prompt a variant screen before the number is trusted. A pearl worth repeating on every ward round. Any condition that shortens red cell lifespan, hemolytic anemia, recent transfusion, acute blood loss, or chronic kidney disease with reduced erythropoiesis, falsely lowers HbA1c regardless of how well or poorly glucose has actually been controlled. In these patients, fructosamine or continuous glucose monitoring data is the more reliable glycemic marker. 3 platforms compete for HbA1c testing, and they are not interchangeable in the presence of variants. Cation-Exchange HPLC is the NGSP-designated comparison method and generally the most variant-sensitive. Boronate affinity HPLC binds the cis-diol on any glycated protein regardless of amino acid sequence, making it largely variant-insensitive. And immunoassay targets the specific glycated N-terminal sequence, with variant sensitivity depending on the antibody's epitope. Quick pause. If this breakdown is helping you, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely takes a lot of effort to make videos like this, and your support keeps them coming. A quick interference map keeps platforms straight. Cation-Exchange HPLC shows the most variant interference, boronate affinity the least, and immunoassay sits in between depending on the specific kit. Knowing your own lab's platform variant interaction table, not a generic rule, is what actually protects patients from a miscalled result. The diagnostic thresholds your report ultimately serves are simple but consequential. An HbA1c under 5.7% is normal, 5.7 to 6.4% defines prediabetes, and 6.5% or above on 2 separate occasions, or once alongside classic hyperglycemic symptoms, defines diabetes under current American Diabetes Association criteria, making analytical precision at exactly that 6.5% cut point clinically decisive. Standardization made this number trustworthy across labs and platforms. The NGSP harmonized U.S. results to the DCCT reference in the 1990s, and IFCC subsequently developed a higher-order mass spectrometry reference method reporting HbA1c in mole or mole. Most reports today still show NGSP %, but the underlying IFCC reference is what actually anchors global platform comparability. The bench takeaway, HbA1c by Cation-Exchange HPLC is powerful and precise, but it is not a number to report blindly. Know your platform's variant sensitivity, flag any red cell lifespan confounder in the chart, and remember that 6.5% is a clinical decision point, not just a laboratory value. A tacrolimus trough-level chromatogram looks deceptively simple. One sharp, well-resolved peak against a clean baseline, run by LC-MS or MS rather than UV because tacrolimus circulates at nanogram per milliliter concentrations that UV detection simply cannot see reliably in a whole blood extract this complex. Tacrolimus pharmacokinetics explain why trough timing matters so much. It's absorbed erratically from the gut, extensively bound within red blood cells, metabolized almost entirely by hepatic and intestinal CYP3A, and excreted primarily in bile. Draw the trough sample even 30 minutes late relative to the next dose and you can shift the reported level enough to change an immunosuppression decision. Tacrolimus has a genuinely narrow therapeutic window, typically 5 to 15 nanograms per milliliter depending on transplant type and time post-transplant, and both directions of error carry serious consequences. 2 low risks acute rejection, 2 high risks nephrotoxicity and opportunistic infection, exactly why accurate, precisely timed HPLC or LC-MS or MS trough monitoring is a transplant program requirement, not an optional extra. Plasma-free metanephrines, quantified by LC-MS or MS, are now the preferred first-line screen for suspected pheochromocytoma and paraganglioma. Normetanephrine and metanephrine are continuously produced within the tumor independent of catecholamine secretion bursts, giving far better sensitivity than a single plasma catecholamine level, which can be normal between hypertensive episodes. Pheochromocytoma remains rare, roughly 2 to 8 cases per million person-years, but the stakes of a misdiagnosis are disproportionate. Undiagnosed catecholamine excess drives a real risk of fatal hypertensive crisis during unrelated surgery or childbirth, exactly why the screening test needs near-perfect sensitivity even for a low-prevalence condition. Catecholamines and their metabolites originate in the adrenal medulla's chromaffin cells, which synthesize and store norepinephrine and epinephrine before controlled release. A functioning tumor here secretes continuously into the metabolite pool even when episodic catecholamine release itself is quiet, the physiological reason metanephrines outperform catecholamines as the screening analyte. Plasma-free metanephrines carry a reported sensitivity around 96 to 100% for pheochromocytoma, meaningfully higher than urinary fractionated metanephrines or plasma catecholamines alone, at the cost of a modest false positive rate driven mainly by medication interference. A positive screen still needs confirmatory imaging or suppression testing before a diagnosis is finalized. A decision point every endocrine lab encounters. A mildly elevated metanephrine in a patient on a tricyclic antidepressant or taking acetaminophen near the draw, repeat after a supervised medication washout, or proceed straight to imaging. Current guidance favors washout and repeat testing first, since tricyclics and several common drugs are well-documented causes of false positive elevation. The through line across both applications, whether you're timing a tacrolimus trough to the minute or interpreting a metanephrine screen against a medication list, HPLC and LCMS or MS only deliver a trustworthy number when the clinical context, timing, interfering drugs, patient state, is captured alongside the chromatogram. Every clinical HPLC assay runs daily QC exactly like any other analyzer. Plot control material against the established mean and standard deviation on a Levey-Jennings chart, and any value drifting outside 2SD demands a Westgard rule check. Column degradation and mobile phase pH drift are the two most common root causes of a slow HPLC-specific bias trend. Method validation under ICH-Q2 guidance requires demonstrating a defined set of parameters before a method goes live clinically. Specificity, linearity, range, accuracy, precision at both repeatability and intermediate levels, detection limit, quantitation limit, and robustness against small deliberate changes in conditions. Skipping any one of these is a documented audit finding waiting to happen. A calibration curve isn't just a formality. Plotting peak area ratio against known concentration across at least 5 to 6 calibrator levels and confirming an R-squared of 0.995 or better, with residuals showing no systematic curvature, is what actually proves the assay behaves linearly across its entire reportable range, not just at the midpoint you happen to check. Migrating a validated method from HPLC UV to LCMS or MS demands real rigor. A Bland-Altman plot across the clinical concentration range, reporting mean bias and 95% limits of agreement, is the regulatory expected way to prove the new platform reports clinically equivalent numbers before you switch patient reporting over. Applying 6 sigma to an immunosuppressant HPLC assay makes the QC frequency decision concrete. With an allowable total error of 15%, a documented bias of 3%, and an imprecision CV of 4%, sigma comes out to 12 divided by 4 or exactly 3.0. Borderline performance that most programs handle by adding a third QC level rather than accepting the risk as is. The HPLC UV versus LCMS or MS decision is a genuine trade-off, not a strict upgrade. Mass spec buys definitive identification and far lower detection limits at meaningfully higher capital and consumable cost and a more complex, specialist-dependent maintenance burden. Many labs keep both, using UV-based HPLC for high-volume routine work and reserving LCMS or MS for low-concentration or medical-legal grade results. Close the QC loop the same way as any other analyzer. Enroll in a recognized external quality assessment scheme for your specific HPLC assay. Review peer group Z-scores every cycle, and investigate immediately if 2 consecutive cycles trend the same direction, since internal QC alone cannot detect a calibration bias shared across an entire reagent or column lot. No HPLC result, HbA1c, a trough level, or a metanephrine, earns clinical trust without all 3 pillars in place. A validated method against ICH-Q2 parameters, daily QC that would catch a drifting column before it matters, and periodic EQA confirming your lab agrees with the rest of the world. Before a single patient sample runs, every validated clinical HPLC method requires system suitability testing. Inject a well-characterized standard and confirm resolution, tailing factor, and reproducibility all meet predefined acceptance criteria. Fail system suitability and the entire run is invalid before you've even injected the first patient specimen. Typical system suitability acceptance criteria are numeric, not subjective. Resolution between critical peak pairs at 1.5 or greater, tailing factor between 0.8 and 2.0, and replicate injection precision under 2% coefficient of variation for both retention time and peak area. Falling outside any single criterion means stop, not proceed with a mental asterisk. One interference thread worth closing the loop on. Several common medications distort results across more than one assay in this video. Tricyclics and certain other drugs distort metanephrine results, and azole antifungals meaningfully raise tacrolimus levels through shared CYP3A metabolism. both well worth flagging on any interpretive comment. Step back and the breadth of today's coverage overlaps more than it first appears. Chromatographic theory underlies every application. HbA1c and therapeutic drug monitoring both depend on precise quantitation against a calibration curve, and both TDM and catecholamine testing lean specifically on LC-MS or MS for sensitivity. Routine UV detection can't match. A practical decision rule for test selection. Reach for immunoassay when speed and cost matter most and interference risk is low. Reach for HPLC when you need better resolution or a charge or size-based separation like HbA1c, and reach for LC-MS or MS whenever definitive identification, nanogram or lower sensitivity, or medical-legal defensibility is the actual requirement. The clinical stakes riding on today's numbers are real and immediate. A mistimed tacrolimus trough can trigger an unnecessary dose change risking rejection or toxicity. A variant-confounded HbA1c can mislabel a patient's diabetes control for months, and a missed pheochromocytoma carries a real risk of fatal perioperative crisis. Precision at the bench translates directly into outcomes at the bedside. If there's one habit worth carrying out of this video, never release an HPLC-based result, HbA1c, a trough level, a metanephrine, without asking what could have shifted the chromatogram before you trust the number, because in this discipline, the physics behind the peak matters just as much as the peak itself. From Martin and Synge's 1952 partition chromatography Nobel Prize to today's UHPLC MS or MS platforms running trace-level trough levels in minutes, the underlying separation science hasn't changed, only your ability to trust the number has, and that trust is earned through validation, QC, and knowing exactly what could interfere with each specific analyte. Here are the key references and sources for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If this helped, like the video and subscribe for more clear, simple explainers, and I'll see you in the next one.